Hello, you're live with BBC News. I'm Anna Foster here at New Broadcasting House in London. You join us in the Radio 4 Today programme studio where we're about to hold the Today debate. We'll be talking about the US-Israel war with Iran and how much it could potentially escalate from where we are now. I've got a distinguished panel who I will introduce you to in just a second when we're joined by listeners on Radio 4. But let me first of all bring you up to date with what has been happening today. And there's been a major development for the Iranian leadership. Israel says it's killed Iran's national security chief Ali Larijani in an airstrike earlier today. Also, it says the commander of the feared Basij paramilitary force, Gholam Reza Soleimani. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu said it gave Iranians, in his word, a better chance of toppling the regime. Tehran has confirmed the killing of Soleimani, but not yet the killing of Larijani. Now, across the Atlantic, President Trump has repeated his frustration with NATO. He has said that members of the alliance were making a foolish mistake, in his words, by refusing to help the US secure the Strait of Hormuz. He also said that America no longer needed or desired NATO assistance and never did. And those comments came just a few hours after the news that the head of the US counter-terrorism group has resigned. This is Joe Kent, who said that he could not, in good conscience, back the war because Iran posed, in his words, no imminent threat to the US. President Trump has called that resignation a good thing. And as Iran continues to strike back, Iraq has battled a wave of drone and rocket attacks in the skies above Baghdad. The US embassy has been hit, and Gulf nations are still coming under attack too, with Qatar and the UAE saying that they intercepted Iranian missiles and drones. So much to talk about, much to inform our debate as we talk about the war, where it is now, 2.5 weeks in, and where it might go next, how likely this conflict is to spiral. So our listeners from Radio 4 will join us in just a moment and we'll get started. The war in the Middle East has dominated the headlines and our collective consciousness since the early morning US and Israeli strikes on Tehran that killed the country's supreme leader 2.5 weeks ago. On the Today debate this evening, we ask, is Donald Trump leading us to all-out war? We perhaps naturally might not want to consider how much worse the conflict could get. But the US president's unpredictability, the war's shifting goals and the growing impact on the global economy combine to create the conditions in which things could quite easily spiral out of control. Consider, for just a moment, the individually significant events which have now become part of the rhythm of this war. The world's most sophisticated warplanes targeting Tehran hour after hour, waves of Iranian missiles trained on Israel, drone attacks on Gulf countries damaging their infrastructure, their economy and their image. Any one of those things would have been major news before this war began. But now they seem part of an ebb and flow which is only ever one miscalculation away from changing the face of the war irrevocably. And what of the man who is ultimately behind it all, Donald Trump? He and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu decided that this was a necessary war. His European allies cautioned him against it. The president has said it will end at a moment of his choosing. But what might that moment look like? How far will he want to go before he feels he's achieved the victory he set out for? And might that choice ultimately be taken out of his hands by the speed of events in this growing conflict? Well, let's consider those questions and more with our distinguished panel, people who know the region deeply and who've been in the rooms where those big decisions have been made in the past. First of all, Carla Sands joins us from Washington, D.C. this evening. She's chair of the Foreign Policy Initiative at the America First Policy Institute and was US ambassador to Denmark in Donald Trump's first term. Professor Lina Khatib is with us, Associate Fellow for the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the independent foreign policy think tank Chatham House in London. Sir Alex Younger was Chief of MI6 for 4 years, between 2014 and 2020. John Casson is a former UK ambassador to Egypt between 2014 and 2018. He was also a diplomat in Washington during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then was in Downing Street during the offensives in Libya and Syria. And also we have with us Jeremy Bowen, the BBC's international editor, who has been following this conflict not just since it began, but Jeremy, for decades beforehand. And I suppose a good place to start when we consider how this conflict could escalate and the question of whether Donald Trump is leading us to all-out war is anybody in control of this conflict right now?
I think the answer to that is in different places and at different times, in control and not in control, and under control. So let's start first of all with Iran. Iran is getting hammered, conventionally speaking. It can't defend itself, conventionally speaking, but using asymmetric warfare, techniques used by weak countries against strong ones, it can impose a lot of costs on its Gulf neighbors, on Israel up to a point, on US bases, and especially the Straits of Hormuz, and therefore affecting the global economy. There's this talk, strategists talk about horizontal escalation, I think they're saying, which sort of means lashing out in all directions at once and spreading the war, spreading the pain. So while they are clearly not in control of the way things are going, they probably, I imagine, feel, we don't know if Larijani has been killed, but I think the people in Tehran are probably feeling we can tough this one out. Survival is victory. We can take more pain. Israel has been very consistent in its war aims. It wants to do terrible damage to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Regime change would be great, but if it's actually confusion and chaos internally, civil war of some sort as a result of some kind of vacuum of power, well, that would be okay as well, as long as it doesn't affect Israel. And I think the calculation is that it will not. And of course, for Mr. Netanyahu, the prime minister, he has spoken for decades. It has been a career-long objective of his to do this. But he's always realized, certainly in the last 15 years or so, that he'd need the Americans. And up to now, he hasn't had an American president prepared to go along with it. But in Donald Trump, he's found one. And that gets us to the United States. On a sort of conventional level of warfare, they do it brilliantly. They're incredibly effective in sweeping up targets, destroying them. They are immensely powerful. They have so many resources. They are laying waste to Iran's military factories, its military industrial complex, its some of its public buildings, its leadership. But when it comes to dealing with the asymmetric side of things, they're struggling. You can see, I would say, by the way that President Trump is lashing out at his allies. He's oscillating wildly in terms of the things that he wants. I think that shows that he's thinking, what am I going to get out of this? How do I declare victory? What is victory? Maybe a week or so, 10 days in, there was a potential moment when he could have said, look what we've achieved, we've won. And he actually said, we've won. A few, without going into too many details, but he said, we want to win more. I don't think he can do that now politically. It's much more difficult. So, as I say, bottom line, sometimes they're in control, sometimes they're not. But of course, war has a dynamic all of its own, and war is a political act. The military is a tool to achieve all of that. And I think one of the big weaknesses on the American side is that without a precise war aim, countries don't know necessarily where to stop.
Carla Sands, you've worked with Donald Trump. What do you think his aim is here? How far do you think he wants this to go?
This is a regime that has said death to America for 47 years. They are an existential threat because as they enlarge their capabilities in long-range missiles and their nuclear enrichment, they will at some point be able to, or they would have been able to reach the US homeland. So President Trump did what every US president said needed to be done for 47 years, but didn't do. In fact, I was in the Bush White House toward the end of his term, and I asked his head of security, so are you going to use some bunker buster bombs before you leave the White House and take out the Iranian nuclear enrichment capabilities because it is an existential threat to the United States? They're saying death to America. And they said, no, we're going to leave it for the next team that comes in. Well, we know what happened. No one has dealt with this. President Trump, thank God, actually, when he sees a problem, he goes in and fixes it, unlike so many feckless leaders the world has seen. And the fact that the NATO allies aren't aligning with President Trump when we have been their security for decades, we've literally brought them out of the abyss and saved them from 2 world wars. It's pretty shocking, but then you see the changes in the relationship, and this goes back decades. This isn't just in this president's era. This has been a changing relationship. To have the UK say, no, you can't use your own base, it really does change the discussion, even around places like Greenland, where we saw the NATO allies rush in a kind of, fig leaf look to give cover to Denmark that doesn't have sovereignty over Greenland because they can't defend it, which is the definition of sovereignty.
There's a couple of things to pick up on there. Sir Alex Younger, I was hoping you could do that for me. I want to talk about the imminence of the threat, but also there was something interesting that Carla said there, the idea that you can't use your own base. These are US bases on UK soil, which is where the complexity arises.
Well, look, imminence is, it's something in English common law. It gives you the right to self-defense if someone's about to attack you. And clearly, and it's the basis on which we choose to defend ourselves, say, in a counter-terrorism format. Now, obviously, in the modern world, when we're going after cells in the tribal areas of Pakistan or Afghanistan or Yemen, it doesn't make sense to talk about, the act happening in a few seconds' time. And it's fair to say that we've had to modernise our understanding of what imminence consists of, and there's not an international consensus, but certainly as far as we're concerned, it is this a lethal threat, and is there any other way of dealing with it? Now, I haven't seen, obviously, because I'm not inside the intelligence, so I don't know, but I would say that it's a deliberately broader definition because it has to be in the hybrid war world.
How detailed will the level of intelligence be that people making those decisions are receiving?
Yeah, I mean, that's so it sounds very clinical as I've just described it to you. Of course, ultimately, intelligence is never perfect. It's fragmentary. It's often contradictory. And the art, actually, and here I have to look to my legal brethren to understand the reality of the world we live in rather than the world we want, it is a judgment call based on the assessed collection of everything you know.
Yeah. Actually, John, I want to ask you about that point, but Lena, first of all, Professor Lena Khatib, we've got the rhetoric, and as Carla was saying there, those messages for years, death to America, death to Israel, and then you've got the counterpoint of whether or not a nuclear weapon does exist or is about to exist. Which of those things, it is difficult to prize those things apart, isn't it, and decide whether to act on words and on a verbal threat, or intelligence that we don't necessarily have about how ready a nuclear weapon may or may not be.
But this has been one of the biggest frustrations for me as someone who's been studying this region for a long time, that the threat of Iran is reduced to the nuclear issue, when Iran has been a major destabilizing actor in the Middle East since the emergence of the Islamic Republic in 1979, and its model of so-called exporting the revolution, which is built on supporting and funding and arming militias like Hezbollah in Lebanon, later Hamas, militias in Iraq, also later on in time the Houthis in Yemen, and also terrorist networks all over the world with financial operations that cross all continents, really. All this has been going on, the support for proxies, the support for terrorism, the possession of ballistic missiles that are now being seen for what they are. They are there to be deployed to destabilize the Middle East. All this was happening, and yet for many years, the focus was just on the nuclear file, as if that was the only issue. And as you said, maybe the intelligence on that is not certain, but definitely everything else I described is vividly out there.
John Casson, when you're sitting in the room, when this evidence is being presented, when decisions have to be made, how do you decide what weight to give all of these different elements?
There's a clear legal framework and a clear strategic framework for when war is necessary, and war should always be a last resort. And I think what we've just heard is that the justifications for this war do not stack up. There is no evidence that Iran had an active nuclear weapons program, as the Director General of the IAEA said last week. There was no evidence being offered that either Israel or the United States faced an imminent threat of attack. And you said, are we being led into a more all-out war? I would point to two dangers of drivers of escalation that we can see here. The first is that when you sweep away all these shifting justifications, it's increasingly obvious that the real impetus for this war is that President Trump was signed up to Prime Minister Netanyahu's long-term approach, which is very content to carry on until a country like Iran is a failing state and in chaos. And from a British perspective, having been in some of the decisions for 4 previous wars in the region, I'm very alert to the fact that there is an impetus towards action that's baked into our regional experts, our politicians, our security system, that makes it very dangerous that we put our hands further and further into the mangle of a conflict like this. And so I think we should be crystal clear that military escalation is the problem here. It's not the solution. And the longer this goes on, the harder it will be to get out of it.
Carla Sands, how do you think that is viewed in the US? And John Casson was talking there about times when those decisions have backfired. Do you think that is something that Donald Trump is considering when he sends these messages to the UK and to NATO allies?
Well, if I could, I just want to reframe the conflict. Remember what President Trump accomplished with his team: amazing military action in Venezuela and cutting off that energy from China and refining it in the U.S. and reopening Venezuela to trade and to U.S. cooperation. We just reopened our embassy after, I think, 7 years. It's amazing.
It's a very different situation, this one, though, isn't it, Carla?
Sorry?
It's a very different situation, this one, though, isn't it?
No, it's part of his plan. So this is also regarding China. Let's not forget that Iran could not be prosecuting even the activity that they are now without assistance from Russia and China. Those Shahed missiles are being made in China today for Iran. And the fact that President Trump is working to reorder the world energy to make it more friendly to the United States, take away, like one of the panelists was talking about, the proxies, which is a threat. This is not the first time the Strait of Hormuz has closed in the past decade. And when it does close, and it's often the Houthi rebels, now it's Iran, it has been affecting the Gulf states, but also world energy trade and world trade writ large. What President Trump is doing now is asking the allies and China as well, which really benefits from the Iranian energy passing through the strait. They need that energy. They take about 90% normally of the Iranian energy. So he's working to reopen it. I've heard talk that some of the Gulf states might come in and help. France has declined. I don't think even the UK, I don't think the UK is capable at this moment of helping, but there should be other allies. He's asked China to help because they benefit so much. So he is asking for the nations that benefit. This should not be on the US to keep the strait open, because like I said, this isn't the first time. This is an ongoing problem with the spread of terror that Iran has been doing in every one of our countries. I mean, they have been the cancer of the world, spreading terror, unrest, and then working with China and Russia and North Korea, if you want to include North Korea, in destabilizing the rest of the world that wants to trade normally and be normal nations. And the Iranian people deserve to have opportunity and be in a part of a normal nation that has trade with the world and has the rule of law and democracy. These people have been under the boot of these ayatollahs and the abusive IRGC for 47 years.
Let's just dig a little bit into this. Sir Alex Younger, can we conflate Venezuela and Iran?
Well, Iran is a much tougher nut to crack than Venezuela, but I do think Donald Trump would have been encouraged and might have hoped on this occasion that a decapitation strike would lead to a collapse in the regime and his chance to assert influence from an aircraft carrier. My issue, without wanting to sound cynical, isn't so much with the principle of this. All of the stuff people have said about the Iranian regime, there are no fans here, and I think it's entirely justified. It's about the execution of this and the idea that we can prosecute regime change from the air. I worry about that. And I think the real asymmetry in this conflict is actually as between a country that feels an existential threat and a country for whom this is a war of choice. And that's generated 3 vulnerabilities for the United States, who, let's face it, have conducted, as is we're getting familiar with, a textbook military operation, which is undoubtedly ahead of schedule, which is undoubtedly doing huge damage to Iran. I shed no tears, frankly, for Ali Khamenei. Can we really achieve our aims from the air without any form of intervention? And there are three big issues here which make me worry about this and make me worry that the US is in the process of losing the initiative. And let's face it, whether you approve of what they've done or not, the reality is they need to succeed. So the first issue for me is we have underestimated the resilience of the regime. They've been preparing for this for 30 years. They very sensibly dispersed their military capability in advance. Their horizontal escalation, which I thought was nuts when they first did it, is actually working really pretty well and producing a lot of pressure on the US government. And now they've worked out that our Achilles heel is the Straits, and that we don't have an appetite for the economic second-order and first-order shocks that this is going to demonstrate. So that's the first issue. And maybe the death of Ali Laranjani will change us. He was primus inter pares in this junta. The imposition of Mujtaba is really just an IRGC takeover. Ali Laranjani was in the middle of it. I think Iran so far there have played a weak hand quite well, and that worries me. What are we going to do about that? Second point, and I regret that the president spoke in the way that he did last week, because I served in Afghanistan when the US announced that they were departing and then wanted to have a negotiation with the Taliban. In his haste to placate the oil market, he has made it clear that the US is in a hurry to get out. And I felt that that augured a shift in the initiative from the US to Iran, that those guys have got to get back quick. And the third one is really nerdy, and I apologize, but some of us have looked at this pretty hard. The reality is that US and Israeli strikes, where the target bank is incredibly deep and where the bombing is very accurate, will nonetheless only ever denigrate 90% of the stock of strategic missiles, drones, and anti-ship cruise missiles. And that does a lot to defang Iran, and it'll make people really happy about the external threat that Iran presents. But it is still enough for them to present an asymmetric threat, persistent over time, such as to keep the straits closed. And that's a killer for us. So those three things are, if I was trying to organise our response and advise the Prime Minister, those are the points that we need to have an answer to.
Lena, how do you see those issues, those challenges being overcome? Because you are positive about this.
I am one of the few voices out there who thinks that this is a just war, and that it's about time for this Islamic Republic of Iran to be no more. I just want to add some nuance perhaps to some of the things already said. One, the sense that this is an existential war for Iran only. Actually, it's also an existential war for Israel. Let's not forget that Israel is right there in the Middle East, and Iran has been very explicit, not just in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of action. And everything changed on October 7, 2023. This is when both the US and Israeli calculations shifted dramatically. And I wrote about the change that has been ongoing, since then, as being akin to the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is the Middle East 1989 that is still playing out. It's going to be a huge change in the regional order once this regime in Iran goes. And that is because this regime has been, as I was saying earlier, a major source of chaos. So when people say, if the regime in Iran falls, there's going to be chaos in Iran. Well, what about the chaos all over the Middle East that has been sponsored by Iran? And I don't think, frankly, that Israel now actually benefits from chaos anywhere in the Middle East. Maybe this was a bit of a different configuration in the past, but under the current circumstances, Israel actually wants lack of threat to be around it, with countries not having military capacity that could one day be turned against Israel. So when you have chaos, it means you have armed groups. It means you still have weapons around that could be turned against Israel. So it is not in Israel's interest for there to be civil war in Iran for that reason alone. And also, let's not forget, that when we saw a lot of chaos in places like Iraq, for example, after 2003, it's because there was an external patron sponsoring these jihadist groups. And Iran actually was a major patron and still is that patron. And so I always say it's not automatically the case that if you remove an authoritarian regime, you're going to end up with militias, because militias without an external sponsor can only do so much.
If I may, Anna, I've spent the best years of my career trying to support the people of this region find a better political future. I would desperately love to see the people of Iran, the people of Lebanon have a better future. But I think it's heroically optimistic to think that this war that's been embarked upon is going to deliver that. I think all the weight of the evidence, everything we know about our ability to start these wars and not have the political will to finish them and build a transition, everything we know about the decision makers in this particular case tells you that the probable outcomes are going to be worse for the people of Iran. They range at best from a more transactional dictator through Iran as a kind of crippled pariah state to a complete meltdown of the country. And I think it's important to note that from Netanyahu's perspective, that is not a bug of this operation. It is a feature. The Israelis have demonstrated in what they say and in what they do, they want their neighbors to get the message that they're prepared to hammer the civilian infrastructure and the civilian population. And every day this goes on, they're dismantling the necessary conditions for a positive political transition. The infrastructure, the economic infrastructure, the institutions, the middle class is a necessary part. And many of the things that an expert like Dr. Khatib has written about as necessary conditions for positive political transition are being destroyed day by day. And I think it's really important that President Trump, the United States, do not outsource to the Israelis and to the Iranians the decisions about when this will end and how it will end. Because as we've just heard, they've got an interest in carrying on and dragging us all a long way down a very dark way.
Okay, I am hearing very familiar rhetoric that I remember hearing during the days of the Syrian conflict. So many people, unfortunately, at that time were saying the Syrian regime should stay because it's better than what might happen after if it were to be removed. Now we're seeing Syria in the after period, post-Assad. And yes, things are far from perfect. However, honestly, very little can be worse than a regime that was killing people in the tens of thousands and imprisoning them and torturing them, which is exactly what the Iranian regime is also doing. And so for me, to say that the Iranian people basically should be left with this regime because this is the best one could hope for, really flies in the face of the tens of thousands of people that the Iranian regime has been, slaughtering, regularly, actually. I mean, recently there was a spike with the protests that happened earlier this year, but let's not forget the last 40-something years when people were also being killed and all that. So, so let's not impose different parameters on people over there that we wouldn't ourselves here in the UK want to live under. And the second thing I want to say is that I talked about Israel, of course, but this is not a case of Israel dragging the US into a war. US interests are at stake as well. When you see the relationship between the United States and Gulf countries in particular, the intertwined economic growth agreements that the United States has made with countries like Saudi Arabia, the security agreements, this is a long-term partnership. It's different from the days when these countries used to be US allies and just follow what Washington says. The US has a stake in these countries succeeding economically and security-wise, and to have a new security infrastructure in the Middle East that would allow the US to step back, knowing its trusted partners can handle things. And so it's a new configuration and can only happen when there is peace in this region, which means peace with Israel. And the Iranian regime certainly saw in that a huge threat, which is part of the reason why October 7, 2023 happened in the first place.
Very interested by what you're saying there. I think that there's definitely going to be a lot of new thinking that needs to be done when this is over. I'm not so certain it will be as positive or as you're hoping for. I I think there's going to be reassessment in Gulf states in terms of their relationship with the United States and with the possible, well, actual in some cases, rapprochement with the Israelis, because the arguments that I'm hearing from them is actually, what has this brought us? How has this made us safer? This security deal we're having with the Americans, well, we've spent billions and billions of dollars on equipment, but we're being hit right now. We're hurting. What are you going to do about it, Mr. Trump? There's that. I think there's also a situation perhaps pending when, here's a scenario, if there is a rump regime, wounded, angry, strong enough still to oppress its people in the country, and strong enough as well, just on a semi-regular basis, to remind people that they're there by lobbing a drone or two or a missile of their stocks that George, you were saying that they're bound to have left over towards its neighbors, towards Gulf oil installations. They've demonstrated that even with, as President Trump has said many times, a navy that is at the bottom of the sea, it's quite possible to close the Strait of Hormuz, which is going to have increasingly painful ramifications for the rest of us.
Carla Sands, have these things been considered?
I just wanted to kind of echo a few things that some of the panelists have said. First of all, that one person said that Iran is a threat and it's an external threat. It's actually an internal threat. In every country, they have had these death squads in their embassies. They have done assassinations on foreign soil, on our soil and yours. This regime has been a cancer, like I said, and what we see is the hopefulness, like the disarmament of Hezbollah in Lebanon, so that the people of Lebanon, after decades of living under the oppression of this murderous Hezbollah, is actually going to be freed and be able to have a healthy society again. It's extraordinary. And the fact that this regime attacked their friends, Oman, Qatar, and it wasn't just US bases, it was civilian infrastructure as well. That's such a shock that they've lost all their friends. And now we can see that President Trump's plan of not necessarily regime change, but certainly saying to the IRGC, lay down your weapons, we'll spare your life. If you continue, we're going to get you. Well, Israel has unbelievable intel. We saw the head of the IRGC was actually paid by Israel and feeding them information. So who knows how deep
there's debate
their
about that,
sources
isn't
go.
there?
They're going to be able to get the bad guys.
That's certainly something that's been discussed. We don't know for sure whether or not that's the case. John Casson, what did you want to say?
And one thing that strikes me as being demonstrated here is that a necessary part of war making is to create a binary choice between the war that you're embarking upon and doing nothing. But I have to say, when I hear that the only way to tackle the Iranian threat was this unnecessary, reckless and illegal war, I feel we're being gaslighted, because the people that have been running that line that Iran has to be dealt with in this way for the last 10 years are the very people who spent the last 10 years dismantling and undermining what was the most concerted and credible international mechanism we created to deter and contain Iran, and to create, in the long run, the societal conditions for a better chance of a positive political transition. It's being used to obscure the fact that they've gone into a war with no thinking about strategic consequences, handing Iran leverage over the world economy, creating incentive for every other potential nuclear proliferator to go for a nuclear weapon as quickly and as cheaply as possible, empowering and enriching Russia. And if I could say a little word about where the UK stands in this, because I wanted to respond to what Ambassador Sands said about her disappointment with the UK. I remember when I was a young diplomat in Washington, the ambassador banned us from using the word special relationship because he felt it made us look pathetic and needy. And I think one thing we can observe about President Trump is that he sensed weakness. And the more we fret and wring our hands about the special relationship, the more we're handing him leverage to come at us. And I think we've seen a better way to handle the fact that the special relationship has changed. You know, when we've got a United States president who's threatening to invade a NATO partner, it's not the same special relationship as we used to have. The way to respond to that is not to offer subjection and slavish obedience in every possible way, but it's to do what we began to do over Greenland, which is consistent, concerted, coordinated diplomacy, to say that we will be there for America when America is attacked. We will remain a pillar of NATO as an Atlantic and European power, but this war is harming us. You need to find a way out. It is not our war.
Carla Sands, what would your definition of a special, the special relationship be?
The Iranian regime literally put an assassination attempt out on President Trump. That's how lethal this group is. It's been very scary in the United States to have our president and commander-in-chief be targeted by this murderous regime.
On that particular point, Carla
one
Sands,
more thing.
I'm keen to hear what you think about that point that John Casson was making.
When Great Britain had an actual standing army and a strong navy.
Interesting. So you think that the so-called special relationship is not really of the same worth to the US now that the UK is not the military force that it once was?
We love Great Britain. We felt like it was a two-way street on the special relationship, but it's a lot more special when the UK has a strong economy, sensible energy policy, a real strong army, and an actual navy that can prosecute a war. Today, the UK could not fight and win the Falklands War because the navy is so depleted because of not enough investments.
No, I accept John's point. I don't want to do binary, but I am really clear that the world would be a better place without the Islamic theocratic regime of Iran, which has formed itself in opposition to the West for many decades and has caused havoc. And what stability we've seen in Iran has come at the expense of instability across the whole Middle East, particularly those who aren't lucky enough to have oil. And, the sins of that regime could take up the rest of this program. But in the end, war is politics by other means, and we need more politics. So I'm in awe of yet again, a demonstration of the firepower, accuracy and professionalism of the US military, but it can't ultimately bring a resolution unless the Iranian regime cracks and at the end of it, someone is left standing of a sort of Dulce Rodriguez stature. And that seems to me like great if it happens, but we need another plan. So can we get political? Can we think about why the IRGC are so resilient? Can someone tell me why they're still being allowed to export oil to China, which is the only thing propping up the regime? Can we think about how we secure, in partnership, some transit of the Straits of Hormuz? This at the moment we are in danger of failing, I think, Einstein's test of doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result.
Jeremy, on that point, the way things are now and the impact it's having on the economy, I think most people would consider that we can't continue this. This can't become a war of attrition that goes on and on and on. So you have two alternatives: de-escalation, or, to bring us back to our central question, further escalation. Which of those do you think is the more realistic or more likely option at the moment?
Well, I think it's down to President Trump, as he said himself. He's got those options. And I think for him, he won't simply want to say, OK, enough. He'll want to be able to present a historic victory. He'll want something to really boast about and celebrate and say, I have made a difference here. And at the moment, they could perhaps construct a victory narrative still, which is something which says, look, we have caused massive damage to Iran's, I should say, capacity to menace its neighbors and to cause trouble in the region. And yet we haven't got rid of the regime, but maybe that's for another day. We'll wait and see what happens. That's on one. Or he might think, and he might be being advised, I don't know, or maybe he's getting advice from Israel, push more, do more. There's a Marine Expeditionary Force on its way from Japan. They've talked about this Karg Island, where the Iranians put through most of their oil exports. What if they took that over? That's something that I know has been discussed at different times and in different fora for some years. They could do that. I mean, militarily, they could do that. What would the consequences be, and in what state, and to what extent would that actually help us get to a positive, in any sense, outcome of all of this? And to what degree would that mean that instead there's just a long-running, maybe even low-level conflict where this wounded Iranian regime lash out, send missiles, drones across the Gulf towards the Saudi oil terminals, the Emirati oil terminals? They're mostly on the coast. They're really exposed. They're really big. They're highly inflammable and very symbolic and vital, of course, to their economies as well. So, I mean, there are no good options right now.
Lena, what elements do you think there need to be in order for a victory to be declared by the US? What needs to be in place to make that something that people will believe in?
Victory means neutralizing the threat that Iran has been posing to the world. And to get there, you do need to go through changing the regime, but not in the traditional, if I can call it that way, that many people imagine. This is not like Iraq in 2003. My prediction is that eventually there's going to be regime implosion. But to get there, you need significant military degradation of the regime capabilities, because for as long as this regime has domestic coercive capacity, people on the inside will not rise against it. And so just, Sir Alex's point on why is the IRGC still together? Well, the very ideology of this regime, and here I'm not talking about religious ideology, I'm talking about the political ideology, is one that is based on the concept of death to America, death to Israel, meaning this is a regime that will fight till the last breath and would rather do that than be seen as surrendering to the US and Israel. Now, compare that with the Iran-Iraq war. At that time, the Iranian regime under Khomeini did, as he put it, swallow the poison chalice. But that was versus Iraq, not the US and Israel, the two Satans in the regime's eyes. And so for me, expecting this situation to be resolved in a matter of days or weeks is frankly unrealistic, because we are talking about a regime fighting an existential war. Meanwhile, we are talking about the US, with Israel's help, trying to change the regional order in the Middle East. And regional orders don't change very swiftly or cheaply or in a linear way.
We've just got a couple of minutes left on the main part of our debate. John Casson, listening to the various perspectives around the table, in a sort of reasonably brief précis, what is your greatest concern at the moment?
I think I want to take a step back, because I've been saying that this is a reckless and unnecessary war, particularly reckless and unnecessary, but it's part of a wider pattern that we are part of. And I find it chilling how ready we've been to sit for year after year in rooms in London and Washington and decide to impose disciplinary violence on the Islamic world. Again and again, we've shown our readiness to start wars and our inability to stick around and win the peace and rebuild things afterwards.
Sounds like that's really changed you.
Yeah, and I think that it makes it all the more important that we resist this relentless impetus for escalation.
Carla Sands, just briefly, when you listen to that, you listen to those cautionary tales, does that change your approach to this conflict?
Well, really briefly, a couple of points. President Trump has been talking since 1988 about taking Kharg Island, and because the IRGC is so decentralized, the head of the Hydra, that it may mean we do have to take control of Kharg Island and really cut off their economy. But there are people inside, cells inside throughout Iran, working to fight against the forces of the Mullah regime, the NCRI. They have a 10-point plan for democracy. They want equality of sexes, freedom of religion, the rule of law, equality from minorities like Kurds. So they have a plan to put in place if they can just topple the regime. And that's very exciting for the people of Iran.
We're going to continue our debate. We're going to say goodbye now to listeners on Radio 4 as we conclude this main part of the discussion. But we are going to carry on in the studio for a little longer. We're going to discuss who potentially the winners and losers, not just within the Middle East, but actually outside of the region, might be in this conflict as well. So you can carry on watching on the BBC News channel, on the BBC News website, the BBC Politics channel on YouTube as well, if that's where you are. Don't forget you can listen back to the debate on BBC Sounds. You can also continue listening now on BBC Sounds, should you choose. But we'll say goodbye at this point to our listeners on BBC Radio 4. And we continue on the BBC News channel, the BBC News website and the BBC Politics channel on YouTube. Jeremy, let's look at, because we've really focused in, and necessarily so, on the region and what is happening there. But when we broaden this out and coming back to that central question of escalation, we use that expression all-out war, which can be defined in different ways. But I think for the ordinary man and woman in the street, that's a world war. That's something where everybody is drawn in one way or another. What do you assess the chances are of that at this stage?
Well, not on that sort of 1939-45 level. No, I don't think we're in that field at all. But the thing about the world these days is it's highly connected. There are many, many connections. And so countries can be involved in wars without actually firing shots in all sorts of ways, because a lot of warfare these days, of course, goes on in the cyber world. It goes on in terms of feeding intelligence. I noticed just as we were sitting down here, the Wall Street Journal says it has an exclusive story about the Russians feeding intelligence and spare parts and other things that the Iranians might need to them at the moment, helping them with their war effort. So those are all connections that happen. China has been quite quiet in terms of public utterances about what it's been saying, but I mean, they've had an increasingly strong interest in the Gulf and also in the Red Sea for quite a bit of time now. So I think they'll be looking with great interest at what's happening, and they will continue to portray themselves as the sensible adults in the room. You know, we're the guys you can rely upon, unlike these Americans who are doing all these sorts of different things in the world. I mean, these are the arguments that are being made by people. So, no, I don't think we're suddenly going to be plunged into a great world conflict in the way that has happened in the past. But I have to say also that in a dangerous and in a world that is dangerous and is connected, the risks of things over a period of years running out of control are great. You know, we have normalized now the fact that there's a really serious war in Europe. Until the day before all this started, I was in Ukraine. I was there for 3 weeks. I was in eastern Ukraine, where this extraordinary drone war is going on, where thousands of soldiers mostly are getting killed. This is happening in the Gulf. In Lebanon, there's not much reported because of everything else that's going on. There's a big thing happening with the Israelis there and Hezbollah, and also in the West Bank. I mean, I can go on, go around the world, but I'm not going to. Suffice it to say, we're normalizing high levels of conflict and danger, and maybe that in the future is what pushes us into the, if it is the 1930s, what year have we reached? I suppose the argument might be.
Let's remember that we're still living with the damage that was done to our economies by the 2008 financial crisis, by the Ukraine war. If the ongoing closure of the Straits of Hormuz will be at least as bad for us.
And too, that the consequences of the 2003 invasion are still very much being felt, not just in the Middle East, but around the world in terms of, the jihadist movements that arose and so on.
Yeah, and we see it in the decisions that are being made in the UK now, don't we? So Alex Younger, on that point, Russia, China, their role in all this, as Jeremy was saying, influential but quite quiet at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, this worries me. I mean, briefly on China, there's a paradox here. They're a status quo power in the Middle East. They are an oil importer, and they're actually net beneficiaries of the US role as policemen of the region. So actually, they kind of want that to continue, but they will also be delighted by any loss of US credibility, and they'll love the fact that all of the interceptors that could have been given to Taiwan are being fired off by the Gulf. The biggest issue for me is, of course, the read across to Ukraine. On the one hand, anyone thinking of being a client state of Russia's should be given pause by the fact that they've lost Syria, Venezuela, and now Iran in a very short period of time, and it's a sign of the limitations of Putin's claims to be a global power, which he makes repeatedly with Donald Trump. But otherwise, it's pretty good news. So obviously the steep rise in oil prices have eliminated the budget deficit in Russia, which in turn will give them the money to pay for more contractors to send to Ukraine to be cannon fodder. It seems there's a weird zero sum in the world around the supply of air defense interceptors. Obviously, That's a thing we should all be making more of. But it's probably true to say that the more that are used up in the Middle East, the less there will be for Ukraine. And then the spat today and yesterday around the utility of NATO and what it's for and what Article 5 is. As a BBC presenter said, it may have been you, Putin will be watching this with popcorn. So all of these things worry me a lot. That should not obscure, however, the fact that, in fact, contrary to a narrative consistently purveyed by Putin, the Ukrainians are actually moving forward in Ukraine at the moment. And I think, actually, Putin isn't going to succeed in his attempts to use the US administration to bully them into submission or to win militarily anytime soon.
My big takeaway from my 3 weeks in Ukraine in February was very much that the Ukrainians are not being defeated. I mean, far from it. It goes back and forth on the front lines. They'll say that, but they're pretty evenly matched. I spoke to one drone commander there, and he said, and he was very honest about it. He said, "Look, the Russians have got really good drone units, really good ones, and we respect their skills. However, sometimes we're ahead, sometimes they're ahead. It varies. It goes back and forth."
And I just hope that we are learning the lessons of this in our increase in defence spending and aren't going to build a load of tanks or whatever it is that don't work anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's very much come to the fore once again, hasn't it? Carla Sands, a question for you. And this might sound like a statement. It's not. It's very much a question. Is it wise, or was it wise, to start a new war when there is still conflicts raging in Ukraine, for example, that ultimately President Trump holds the key to solving? Should he have focused more on those, trying to solve those problems before creating new ones?
Right. Well, President Trump is the peace president. Let's not forget, he set up the Board of Peace, and many nations have joined it to end wars and especially bring about a good transition in Gaza and for Israel, so that there's peace and there's prosperity and there's development without animosity from the Palestinians. And if you think about what President Trump is doing, this could actually hasten the end of the Ukraine war. Now, I know Russia has a little more money coming in because of the price of energy right now. But as a matter of fact, their two friends who have been helping them prosecute this war, Iran is really busy and being decapitated. And then China is, I think, very nervous because there's an energy squeeze on China by President Trump's actions. China is the only country that their energy is going like this. They're building 30 new coal-fired plants right now. They buy a lot of American coal. They're building 38 new nuclear plants. Now you contrast that with the US and EU combined. Our energy is going like this. We're steady, but we're not growing. And in this age of data and AI, we have to be increasing our energy phenomenally. And the US is working on that, but we're selling a lot of it to our allies. This activity, yes?
I just wanted to I wanted to sort of pull it back to the central theme a little. Jeremy, the idea that this new war in Iran might hasten the end of the war in Ukraine, is that a workable theory?
Can't quite see it myself, I have to say. Can't quite see it myself. I think that the Ukrainians are I interviewed Zelensky when I was over there in Kyiv, actually, and what he wants more than anything is the interceptors. And there was never enough. He was being told there's only a limit. The US needs a certain amount. They have to give interceptors to Israel. And now those stocks are being burned through. He's trying to get licenses to produce them in Ukraine. And it's not being given them by the US. The Patriots particularly is the things that they want. So no, I don't particularly see that happening. And I do think that actually President Putin at the moment, he's lost allies, no doubt about that, but he's getting more money coming into the bank, and that's really important for them, because one of the big arguments about this year was that the Russians were really going to start feeling it economically. This was going to be their Achilles heel in 2026. Those arguments were being made at the beginning of the year and the end of last year. And suddenly they got a windfall.
They did. Lena Khatib, what picking up on something else Carla Sands there about, she called President Trump the peace president. When we look at the Middle East, this idea of achieving peace through war, you're smiling at me in response to that. Is that something that that works, that has worked, that might work?
Yes, because we have war, so we can't pretend that it's not there. So we are where we are. There's no point in wishful thinking. If we didn't have wars raging, then it would be a different answer. But we have to look at where we are. There is war. So the idea of theoretical reasoning doesn't really help us. What will help us is thinking, okay, how do we use this war to achieve peace? And is this war actually going to advance peace in the long run? And I will say yes, because of all the things I have said before about the threat that the Iranian regime poses to the Middle East and to the world. If you're going to be achieving peace in the Middle East, you have to solve two things. One is the Iranian issue. Second is the Israel-Palestine conflict. Because without these two things, you're not going to have any peace in the Middle East.
Let's use our last few minutes I'd like to hear from all of you really, where you think, and Lena, you've sort of set us on the path quite neatly there, where you think this war might end. John Casson.
Well, I think the idea that we should take heart from Donald Trump's ability to produce peace in Gaza, I think that he knows what he's doing here, should give us pause and make us realise the amount of wishful thinking we're hearing tonight. It does remind me of sitting in Washington in 2003. And let me just try and puncture the wishful thinking a little bit. Our deluded addiction to military interventions in this region, going back before Iraq, going back to the beginning of the Islamic Republic of Iran, is a key driver of the radicalization and violence and conflict in this region. And I hope that listeners at home will feel as much grief as I do at hearing all this stuff coming around again and again. And I just take heart from the fact that the UK government has managed to get itself now to a position of saying we're not a protagonist in this war. And I hope that we can become clearer about that. This is not our war. We were not consulted on it in advance. It's harming us. And maybe we can say, as the French and the Germans did yesterday, we will not be sending British assets and British people into the Straits of Hormuz while this war goes on. We should be saying to our ally, the United States, you are harming us and you need to find a way to end this.
Carla Sands, how does this war end?
Well, the U.S. taxpayers look at the Ukraine war and say it wasn't our war either, but we invested $300 billion under the prior administration. So, sure, thanks for being an ally. We were there when you needed help, but we're not seeing it from the other side. And I think it does help us recalibrate. I don't have a crystal ball, but I do know that President Trump and his team will get a good outcome. This is so complicated. It's much harder, like one of your panelists said, than Venezuela. But the people of Iran and the people of the UK, the people of the United States deserve not to live under the threats of this regime. And all of us deserve peace. And you can't have peace with a regime like this armed with long-range missiles or with nuclear weapons, which they said to our negotiator, we can make nuclear weapons right now.
So
they said that at the table.
Sir Alex Younger.
If I was confident that the US really could take this through to its logical conclusion, then I might be up for an argument with John about the utility of military force, because I have zero sympathy for a regime that in January killed over 10,000 of its own citizens. But in practice, I think given the domestic pressures that exist in the US and the asymmetry, as I say, of motives, I think eventually, however weird and unthinkable it might seem, there will be a conversation of some kind. I think US actions need to be seen in that context, which is essentially an attempt to build leverage. And I think that's why the Marine Division is on its way to the Straits. It's why Hog Island is being held at threat. Yeah. It's why there may be a raid of the nuclear facility. Who knows?
Thank you to our panel, Sir Alex Younger, John Casson, Carla Sands, Professor Lena Khatib, and Jeremy Bowen, our international editor. Much more to come. We continue to follow this story, so stay with us here on BBC News.